During the Second World War, one of the greatest military clashes to take place was between these two mighty tanks, the American Sherman and the German Tiger. These two monsters went head-to-head in the D-Day landings in some of the most brutal battles the world had ever seen. Only one tank could be the winner. Which would it be? On June 6, 1944, the Americans, British, and their allies launched the D-Day landings on the northern coast of France. They fought bravely together against the common German enemy. The Allies' objective, to gain a precious foothold into Nazi-occupied Europe. With the coast secured, more hard work lay ahead. Allied forces, led by Sherman tanks, would still have to punch their way through German defenses in France, Belgium, and Holland on their way to Berlin. But around every corner, in every orchard, and in every hedgerow, the terrifying Tiger tank was lying in wait, aiming to stop the Allied forces in their tracks. The German Tiger was a landmark in Nazi military hardware. It was first unveiled on Hitler's 53rd birthday in 1942, and on the Führer's directive, it was to be bigger, heavier, and more deadly than any tank ever made. The German Tiger weighed 56 tons, and at the time, was equipped with the largest gun to be fitted to a mass-produced tank. With its sheer size and devastating firepower, it soon took on a mythical status among enemy Allied crews.
I looked upon it as something indestructible, and if it was everywhere you went, if you passed a wood on your flank, say 1,000 yards away, you'd wonder what was lurking in there.
The fact was, it was a Tiger which was dominant in crews' minds. I'm sure people saw Tigers when they were there.
If he sees you, you haven't got a chance, have you? If you see him, you still haven't got a chance.
Because of the legends surrounding this beast of a tank, Allied crews soon came to fear its ominous angular shape and looked for it everywhere.
On this one occasion, we saw a square shape in the orchard, and we said automatically, that may be a Tiger, let's not beat about the bush, fire. And I fired, very good first shot, and there was a huge explosion of splinters, and we realized we'd shot up one of the farmers' outside toilets.
At the same time, the Americans had been working on a design of their own. The Army needed a versatile tank, which would ultimately lead the Allied assault in the planned D-Day landings. It was a vast improvement on Allied tanks that previously had been built. It was called the M4, or as crews came to know it, the Sherman.
My first impression of the Sherman, I thought was brilliant because the maneuverability of it, and as a driver, it had such a wonderful compartment, controls were good, and I honestly, my first impression, I couldn't fault the Sherman, really. I was very impressed with it.
The Sherman quickly became the tank chosen for mass production and used by all Allied forces, the Americans, Canadians, British, and eventually, even the Russians. And when on June 6, 1944, the Allies needed a tank for the D-Day landings, there was nothing better. The Sherman, trusted by crews and infantry alike. That was until it came into contact with the German Tiger.
Of course, we didn't know then what the Germans had, really.
No, but I was going to say, I don't think then I knew anything about Tigers.
Well, no,
at that stage.
They didn't tell us much about the Tiger.
No, they didn't, until we saw this Tiger, which had been captured. And it had 20 to 25 shell marks on it, where it hadn't penetrated. And then, of course, when you saw other tanks, other Shermans burn in front of you, you know, sort of not your competence about a bit.
And I used to count the graves, because they were often then just buried behind the tank or somewhere. And you'd see 2, 3, 5, and if it was a 5, of course, they'd all gone. And that's really when my confidence began to slip a bit.
Was the Allied Sherman inferior to the Tiger? And did the Tiger's prowess really live up to its fearsome reputation? A contest like this would be judged on 3 main factors: firepower, armor, and mobility. Which of these 2 tanks would triumph in these categories? First, firepower. To create the Tiger, the Germans shoehorned their highly successful 88mm anti-aircraft gun into an armored body to produce an awesome tank-killing arsenal. The Sherman was not primarily designed to be a tank killer because its smaller diameter quick-loading artillery gun made it ideal for infantry support. And that's why the Allied Sherman's gun was so much smaller than the German Tigers, as were the shells it fired. On the left is the 75mm diameter high-explosive round of the Sherman. Impressive in its own right, but compare that with the size of the 88mm armor-piercing round that the German Tiger fired. The damage caused by one of these was absolutely devastating. The Tiger's gun was larger and more powerful in every way, capable of destroying an Allied Sherman at 1,500 yards. The Sherman's gun was so weak, it could not penetrate anything over 300 yards. It would have to get within a minimum of 60 yards to have a real chance of taking out a Tiger.
I didn't have the exact experience, but I've spoken with people who had the experience of being within 30 to 50 yards of a Tiger, firing the main gun of the Sherman, and seeing the shot bounce off the plates of a Tiger.
There was no greater example of the Tiger's superior range than at the Battle of Goodwood, 6 weeks after the D-Day landings. Perched on a hill overlooking the advancing Allies, the German 88mm guns destroyed a staggering 400 Shermans before the Allies could even get close enough to fire a shot on target. These men were there, on opposite sides. Ken Tout in an Allied Sherman, and Heinz Bleidiesel in a German Tiger. Over the 2 days of carnage, Heinz's Tiger troop wiped out at least a dozen Shermans.
20 to 25 Shermans appeared, and we started to fire when the range was optimal, and every round hit a Sherman and they went up in flames.
Yes.
In a few minutes, it took us 30 minutes for 12 Shermans, and the other 2 had bailed out. They were undamaged, and we took them back afterwards.
So round 1, firepower, goes to the German Tiger with its lethal 88mm gun. Just as important as firepower was a tank's armor, and the German Tiger had an advantage here too, as military vehicle specialist Tony Lawrence explains.
The armour of the Tiger varied in thickness depending on what part of the tank. The frontal armour was up to about 4 inches thick, the side armour less, and the turret armour less. Even so, the frontal armour was impervious to pretty well anything that the Allies could throw at it. Really, the Tiger was a mobile pillbox.
To keep the Sherman lighter, the Americans used much thinner armor, in fact, almost half the thickness of the German Tigers. Experts will demonstrate the difference this makes here at an ordnance testing range in southern England. They've set up an experiment to replicate the effects of a direct hit from a German 88mm round on the 2-inch thick side armor plating of an Allied Sherman tank. The real measure of strength will be the potential damage to the crew inside, represented by these targets. High-speed video cameras will record the impact and show how well the armor stands up to the modern equivalent of the Tiger's deadly firepower.
Confirm range clear all round.
Range clear all round, clear red.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The effects are devastating. The Allied Sherman's armor plating is too thin to withstand the raw firepower of a round fired from a gun like the German Tiger's 88. It has penetrated the armor, sliced right through the crew, and exited the other side. For a tank crew during the Second World War, the chances of surviving an impact like this were incredibly slim.
We were advancing through an orchard, but when we got to the edge of the orchard, I heard a gun was firing, which sounded like an 88, and I looked across about sort of 200 yards, and I could see a gun. Suddenly the camouflage came off it a bit, and they were firing at someone else's tank, possibly Nobby's or the other one next to you. I sort of came a bit out of the trees, and then I could see that the gun was beginning to swivel around towards us. And of course, eventually, it was facing directly at our tank. We were sort of looking down the muzzle. And the next minute it fired and struck our tank up just above the right track. As it entered the tank, first thing I noticed was the shaft was light as it had punched through, and it was an almighty bang, as you may imagine. That was about, I suppose, this much from me, about a yard across the tank, and only about a foot from the co-driver. It struck the ammunition bin, went white hot, and then it shot out underneath and broke the track. But we all got out and we all survived. Extremely lucky. Must have been our lucky day.
Brian only survived because the Allied Sherman's armor was so thin, the German shell passed through the tank's wall and straight out the other side, without touching the crew. Few Allied soldiers were as lucky, however. Some who lived to tell the tale of their battle with a Tiger were faced with a grisly task, recovering the remains of other Allied Sherman crew. Wally Tarrant remembers.
The biggest part was down in Lisieux, where we lost 4 tanks in one street. So I come down because I knew them all, you know, and we went into the tank to try and see if we could find anybody we knew, and that was terrible, you know. You found a pair of shoes, and is that Track Pin Walsh? I thought. I said, he had big feet. I thought that must be him, you know. And then the driver I knew, and I thought, that's the driver. He said, yeah, but we got to be sure of it, find his tag, you know. And a lot of them was just called missing.
A German Tiger taking a direct hit from a Sherman round produced very different results. For German crews, the Tiger's thick armor made it a safe place to be.
When you were hit, let's say by a Sherman, you thought there was a lightning in your tank for a few seconds, except that sometimes I was thrown back a little bit. But afterwards, it was as if nothing had happened.
So not only did the German Tiger surpass the Allied Sherman in terms of firepower, its armor appeared to be resistant to anything the Allies could fire at it. But in time, all that would change. In the weeks after the D-Day landings, Allied Sherman tanks had been decimated by the devastating firepower of the German Tiger tank force. Stories of Shermans penetrating the Tiger's thick armor with their tiny 75mm guns were few and far between. That was until a British innovation changed the Sherman into a tank that could challenge the Tiger head-on. The Firefly.
The Firefly was a last-minute, desperate attempt to put a really decent gun into the Sherman tank. And the British had available the 17-pounder, which was more or less equivalent to the Tiger's 88mm. They tried to put it into the Sherman, found it wouldn't fit. And in the end, ingeniously, they got it fitted into the turret by doing a 90 degrees twist, and they were able to insert it into the rather smaller turret of the Sherman.
This is the Sherman as it was originally developed with a 75mm gun. This is the Sherman Firefly with a 17-pounder anti-tank gun. The pea shooter, the tank killer.
That ought to give them something to think about.
But it was too little, too late. The Allied Sherman Firefly, even with its superior artillery, was never produced in mass quantities, primarily because the Americans were reluctant to fit a foreign gun on their tanks. Rounds 1 and 2, firepower and armor, belonged to the German Tiger tank. Will the Sherman turn the tables when it comes to mobility? At almost twice the weight of the Allied Sherman, the German Tiger could only reach a top speed of 23 miles per hour. The Sherman was much faster and could go places where the larger Tiger would simply get stuck.
Shermans are very mobile. They were a reasonably fast tank. I've actually been in the Sherman getting up to about 30 miles an hour, which is quite a hairy experience. In the Sherman, you could go along any normal metalled road, cross country. The Tigers were much, much slower, but also, of course, their weight told against them. At 56 tons, it's fine going along nice, flat, dry ground. Once you start getting into mud, they're going to sink. Once you start going over small bridges, the bridges are going to crumble.
The Sherman was perhaps much better, much faster. Our maneuverability was really inadequate. And the engine was too slow.
And it wasn't just on the move that the Allied Sherman was faster than the German Tiger. Its turret could turn more rapidly, an advantage that could mean the difference between life and death.
If you compared with the Sherman, I would say the Sherman was much better. It took us 3 to 5 minutes turning the turret round by hand, and perhaps 2 minutes or 1.5 minutes by engine.
So although inferior in terms of firepower and armor, the Allied Sherman was vastly superior to the German Tiger when it came to mobility. Not only did the Sherman win this round, it also had something else, something colossal on its side: the full weight of the American automobile industry. And this car held the key to the eventual dominance of the Sherman over the German Tiger on the battlefield.
Here in the Detroit tank arsenal, we forged the armaments of victory.
Back in the U.S., everyone was working together to help the Allied war effort in Europe. Not only were the public playing their part, but in this golden age of cooperation, the big three car manufacturers, General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, joined forces to take control of Sherman tank production. As a result, new Shermans rolled off the assembly lines using components taken directly from the automobile industry. For example, this Ford Pilot's V8 engine was also fitted to some Sherman tanks. This flexibility in construction, simple design, and massive manufacturing backup meant that in Normandy, destroyed Allied Shermans could be replaced in 36 hours.
When I was knocked out, I went straight back and they gave me a Sherman straight away, get back up.
Our tank was an older one than the one we'd lost, and it had been belonged to a squadron leader, a major, who'd had his head blown off in there, and they cleaned it all up and disinfected it, and that was pretty good. And they put us in that, and off we went.
The Germans didn't have that kind of industrial backing. In fact, it could be argued that one of Hitler's greatest mistakes was to have commissioned such an enormous and complicated machine like the Tiger, when much simpler tanks could have been built in greater numbers. For every one Tiger coming off the production line, the Germans could have afforded to build 3 of their smaller but lethal Panzer Mark IVs.
They lost the plot of it. And this is the problem with all of their industry. They were still producing grandiose products right up to 1945, when they should have just concentrated on some of their proven successes and just concentrating on getting those out as quickly as possible.
The German Tiger was a complex, over-engineered machine, which shared few common parts with any other German tank. It took a long time to make, was less reliable, and had sparse ground assistance when it needed repair. In the field of combat, a minor fault could disable the Tiger, and unlike the Allied Sherman, a dead Tiger could not be replaced easily.
We had lots of engine trouble. In my car, after 100 yards, it was already broken down. So we had to wait for people to get it running again, who never came, by the way. The war ended before they actually arrived.
Now a reconstruction of a typical tank battle will demonstrate how the Allied military strategists used the Sherman's superior numbers to overrun the defending German Tigers and to beat a path through Europe and eventually to victory over the Nazis.
Imagine a little scenario in Normandy. We have a Tiger tank here, sitting up in a hedgerow, hidden from the Allies. We have a troop of 4 Shermans crossing a field. The first one, these turrets will be turning, they'll be on the lookout for anything suspicious. The Tiger will take him out straight away with one shot. The second Sherman, he'll realise there's an enemy gun or something in the hedgerow. He will probably try and aim a shot towards the hedgerow, roughly where he thinks whatever it is might be. But by then the Tiger has reloaded and has taken this one out. The third tank, he will have seen the Tiger by now. He will try and use his other tanks as shield. He will come round, he might be able to get a shot off, and he will make a beeline for a sunken ravine over on the other side. But by then the Tiger will have reloaded, he will have gone. In the meantime, the fourth member of the troop, seeing what's happening, he will know the only vulnerable spot on the Tiger is the rear. He will try and go round to the rear of the tank and he will try and take out the Tiger from the rear. And we have 1 Sherman out of 4 surviving.
And just as the Shermans were sacrificed for the Allied war effort, so too were their crews.
I felt very expendable, especially when we landed in Normandy. And when you see so many casualties in Normandy, and every day we were having casualties, you did feel, is my number next, you know.
In the end, the Allies won the ground war by their sheer numbers. The Sherman was produced in massive quantities, almost 50,000 of them, but only about 1,300 German Tigers were ever built. In order to advance through Europe and onto Berlin as swiftly as possible, Allied generals realized that even if they had to sacrifice 3 or 4 Shermans and their crews to destroy 1 Tiger, they would still have plenty to replace their losses, whereas the Nazis would not. Based purely on numbers, the Sherman was the superior weapon. But given a choice between the tanks, the crews on both sides had a different view.
But I think I'd better say the Tiger.
I'd rather be in a Tiger myself.
I'd have to say it'd be the Tiger.
I think I'd go for the Tiger.
There's no question about it. I would always choose the Tiger.
This contest wasn't about quality, it was about quantity. Although the Allied Sherman was inferior to the German Tiger both defensively and offensively, the Sherman's superiority in numbers overran and eventually defeated all the Tiger tanks. In 1945, the Sherman led the Allied forces onto Berlin and to victory. And that's why the Sherman tank wins this great military clash. But this was not the only great showdown of war machines in World War II. 18 months before Pearl Harbor, the British were alone, fighting to preserve their freedom against the marauding Nazi forces. By the summer of 1940, Germany had total control of mainland Europe, and England was next on the list. The Battle of Britain was about to unfold. But before an